There is a detail about the sky that almost no one has the courage to face, and it changes absolutely everything. The first fall in history did not happen on Earth. It happened in the most perfect place there is. And this raises an uncomfortable question. How could something created to remain in order manage to break from the inside? Because if the sky, where everything was aligned, pure, perfectly adjusted, suffered a rupture, then the problem was never the environment. It was something much deeper. And this is where it all starts to get weird. Because we have been taught to imagine angels as distant, almost decorative figures. But this idea hides the central point. What existed there was not just beauty. It was function. It was purpose. It was hierarchy. And within this perfectly organized structure, something started to fall out of place. No warning, no noise, no visible conflict, but with consequences that would span the entire existence. Now think about it. If everything was in order, what could be strong enough to break that order from the inside out? And even more disturbing, why was one of the highest ones the first to fall? It wasn't the weakest. It wasn't the furthest away. It was someone who was too close. And that completely changes the way this story needs to be understood. But there is one detail that almost no one notices. The fall did not start with one action. She started with an intention. And when that happened, heaven was never the same. The most dangerous point in this story is not the fall itself. It's what she reveals about what was already happening before she became visible. Because almost everyone imagines this moment as a sudden explosion, an isolated event, a rebellion that came out of nowhere. But the first rupture in the sky seems to have started in a much quieter way. And exactly for that reason, much more frightening. It didn't start with war. It didn't start with screaming. It didn't start with an open confrontation in front of everyone. It began where almost no one can see it, inside a being who occupied a high position within the created order. And that changes the reading of everything. Because when the Bible calls angels ministering spirits in Hebrews 1:14, it is not just describing heavenly beings. She is revealing a logic. Angels do not exist, first, to be admired. They exist to serve, to fulfill a function, to operate within an order that points to something greater than themselves. But then the big fracture appears. What happens when someone raised to reflect begins to desire centrality? What happens when someone appointed to serve begins silently to reinterpret their position? This is where almost everyone looks too quickly and misses the key detail. The issue is not just who fell. The question is why the fall began precisely where there was more proximity, more prominence, more expression of glory. And that's what makes Lucifer so unsettling, because this story isn't just about sudden evil. She talks about internal displacement, about a heart that stopped looking up and started looking at itself. But the most impressive is yet to come, because before understanding why Lucifer fell, we need to face a previous question, perhaps the most ignored of all. After all, what is an angel really? The most common mistake about angels begins before the question is even asked. Because when most people hear this word, they think about appearance, wings, light, shape, figure. But this type of image, although striking, can hide precisely the most important point. On a biblical basis, angel is not defined first by what it seems. It is defined by what it does. And that changes everything. Hebrews 1:14 pushes understanding to a much deeper place, angels are presented as ministering spirits. In other words, beings linked to the service, sending fulfillment, execution of a superior will. Their identity is not born from display. It is born from function. They don't exist to draw attention to themselves. They exist to respond, serve, move, fulfill. And this is where this story begins to take on a different weight. Because if an angel is defined by the function he performs within God's order, then his greatness is not in the form he possesses, but in his fidelity to the purpose he carries. The center has never been appearance. It was never highlighted. It was never autonomy. It was alignment. It was obedience. It was position within a larger structure. But there is one detail that almost no one notices. When function loses its center, identity begins to deform. And this is more dangerous than it seems. Because while many people try to imagine how the angels were seen, perhaps the most important question is another. Where were they facing? What sustained their existence? What kept everything in perfect order before the rupture? That's the key. Angels, in biblical logic, are not independent beings building their own importance. They are messengers, servants, agents of a higher reality. They exist in reference to God, not in competition with Him. And that is exactly why the fall of one of them becomes so serious. Because the first great deviation in heaven did not happen when a being lost beauty. It happened when someone connected to the service began, silently, to move away from their own purpose. And when that happens, the rupture has already begun, even if no one has seen it yet. Before the fall, there was something that many people underestimate when they think about heaven. Order. Not just beauty, not just glory, not just spiritual beings occupying the same sacred space. Order. An order so precise that each existence made sense within a larger structure. Nothing was loose, nothing was random, nothing worked around self-interest. The sky before the rupture was not just a place of presence, it was an environment of absolute alignment, and that is decisive, because there is only real rupture where there was harmony before. There is only fracture where there was unity before. And it is precisely here that this story gains an unsettling strength. When we think of heaven, we often imagine only peace. But the peace there was not a vague feeling. It was the consequence of a perfect hierarchy, of a clear arrangement, of preserved functions, of an indisputable centrality. Everything existed facing God. Everything found meaning in Him. Everything was organized around Him. That's the point. Heavenly order did not depend on improvisation. She depended on submission, of position, of recognition. And this completely changes the way the fall needs to be seen. Because the problem does not arise in a chaotic environment. The problem arises in a perfectly ordered environment. But then the question appears that really starts to bite. How does a structure like this start to crack? How does something established in perfect reference to God undergo the first displacement? And more than that, how does this displacement begin without the visible order seeming to collapse at the same moment? This is where everything gets more tense. Because the rupture does not begin when order disappears completely. It begins when someone, still within the order, no longer agrees with the place they occupy within it. From the outside, everything may appear intact. Inside, the fracture has already begun. And this detail is what sets the stage for everything that comes after. Before the shock, there was stability. Before the rebellion, there was organization. Before the fall, there was a position. And that's exactly why the next step in this story is so disturbing, because the one who would fall first was not someone outside the order. He was someone deeply embedded in her. And this is where the story goes from being just impressive to becoming deeply uncomfortable. Because the first to fall was not someone irrelevant within the heavenly order. It was someone in a high position. Isaiah 14:12 projects this image powerfully. As you have fallen from heaven, O morning star. And even surrounded by debates about the breadth of this text, the image remains too powerful to ignore. It points to someone associated with brightness, prominence, height, evidence. Not an erased being, not someone far from the center of the order, but someone whose position made his fall all the more disturbing. This is the point that almost always goes unnoticed. The rupture does not begin on the periphery. It begins in a place of exaltation. And that makes everything more serious. Because the higher the position, the greater the impact of the deviation. The higher the reference, the deeper the fracture when it becomes corrupted. Lucifer does not appear in this construction as a symbol of fragility, but of deviated greatness. And this is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. It didn't fall due to lack of access. It didn't fall by distance. He didn't fall through ignorance. Fell from a high position. But then the inevitable question arises. What happens inside someone who already occupies a high place? What changes in a being whose function was part of the celestial order, but who, at some point, no longer accepts this position as sufficient? This is where everything gets more tense, because the great tragedy is not just where he fell. It lies in the fact that the height was not enough. There was position, there was prominence, there was an insertion in the order, and yet something started to move in the wrong direction. This shatters a dangerous illusion, the idea that proximity to glory guarantees automatic loyalty. Does not guarantee. In fact, this story suggests something much more serious. Someone might be close, very close, and yet allow within oneself a desire to surpass the place one has received. And when that desire arises, everything changes. Because the problem is no longer position, it's ambition. And what comes next will not be provoked first by a visible gesture, but by an internal movement that almost no one would notice at first. But there is one point in this story that almost always goes unnoticed. The fall did not begin when Lucifer rose. It started when he began to see himself in either another way. This is the first sign of rupture, not a visible movement, not a public statement, not an immediate confrontation, but a silent change at the heart of the intention. And that makes everything much more tense, because major meltdowns almost never start outside. They begin the moment someone, still occupying the same place, no longer relates in the same way to what they received. From the outside, the position continues, the function continues, the structure continues, but inside, something has already changed. Isaiah 14:13-14 reveals this shift with frightening force. I will ascend, I will exalt, I will be like the Most High. Do you notice the pattern? Before there was a fall, there was already a corrupted imagination. Before there was a visible rupture, there was already an inner narrative being constructed. And this is where everything gets complicated, because the first sign was not an action against God. It was an intimate review of greatness itself. It was the moment when the creature stopped seeing itself as part of the order and began to imagine itself above it. This detail is decisive. The sky was not first shaken by an external attack. It was touched by an internal distortion, an ambition that grew in silence, a desire that no longer just wanted to serve. I wanted to go up. I wanted to occupy. He wanted to get closer to a place that never belonged to him. But there is an even more disturbing detail. At first, this type of rupture makes almost no noise. She matures in secret. It feeds on comparison. It grows in the contemplation of its own brilliance. And when it finally becomes visible, it is already too advanced to be called a momentary impulse. That was the first sign. Not the fall itself, but the birth of the desire to go beyond the limit of one's own function. And when this desire appeared, the heavenly order had already been wounded at its most sensitive point, because everything that would come later, the rebellion, the fall, the impact on the sky, was already contained in that invisible moment in which a being created to reflect decided to rival. And then we get to the point where the question changes form. It's no longer just who fell. It's why was he first? Because this is the part that really exposes the gravity of what happened. Lucifer was not the first to fall by chance. It was not a random choice within the heavenly order. The first fall happened in him because the first break happened in him. It all started inside. No desire. In secret exaltation. In the silent refusal to remain in the place he had been given. Isaiah 14:12-15 leads right to this center. The language rises as ambition. I will ascend to heaven. I will exalt my throne. I will be like the Most High. And this is where the fall is explained. Lucifer was the first to fall because he was the first to transform received greatness into a claim to autonomy. He was the first to not just want to participate in the order, but to replace it himself. This is the real beginning of the rebellion, not a visible war at first, but the inner decision not to be content with reflecting. He wanted to occupy. I wanted to ascend. I wanted to go beyond the limit of being a creature without ceasing to be a creature, and this contradiction made the fall inevitable. Because pride always carries an impossible promise. The idea that one can rise against the center of it all and still stand. It cannot. And that's why he was first. Because the fall always begins at the point where the creature tries to reposition the center around itself, before anyone else follows, before any echoes of this rupture spread, before any wider impact on the sky. There was the inauguration of the no in it, the first departure, the first refusal, the first desire to rival the Most High. And when that happened, the sentence was already embedded in the movement itself. However, you will be hasty, says the text. Do you understand the strength of this? He wanted to go up, but it was hasty. He wanted to exalt himself, but he was shot down. I wanted to occupy an undue height, but he found the fall. This is the default. The rise of pride already contains the direction of ruin. And perhaps this is exactly what makes Lucifer the first to fall, not just because he desired more, but because he transformed the gift into a reason for self-elevation. He transformed his position into a platform of pride. It turned proximity into an occasion for rebellion. And the instant this happened, something unprecedented flashed across the sky. For the first time, a created will stopped revolving around God and tried to revolve around itself. That was the real collapse, and everything that came after was just the visible consequence of something that at that moment had already collapsed inside. And when this rupture finally became irreversible, the impact was not restricted to a single being. This is one of the deepest points of this story. The first fall was not just the fall of Lucifer, it was the first shock in the heavenly order, because until that moment, everything existed in perfect reference to the Most High. Everything was found a place in the centrality of God. Everything was supported by a harmony that did not depend only on beauty, but on absolute submission. When Lucifer internally breaks with this order, what emerges is not just an individual drama. A symbolic fissure appears in the very environment of glory. And this needs to be understood carefully. It doesn't mean the throne was threatened. It does not mean that God has lost control. It does not mean that heaven has entered into absolute chaos. The initial impact was of a different nature. It was the entrance to the rupture where before there was only alignment. It was the emergence of opposition where before there was only agreement. It was the manifestation of rebellious will in a place that until then had only known service. And that, in itself, was already something huge. But there is one detail that makes everything even stronger. The first no of creation did not echo from earth. It echoed from the sky. It was there that, for the first time, a creature tried to sustain its own exaltation before the one from whom all order proceeds. And even though divine authority was never threatened, the spiritual effect of this rupture was enormous, because a line had been crossed. Something that should never exist came to exist. Rejection, pride elevated to rebellion, misalignment within the created order. That was the initial shock, not the collapse of the sky, but the revelation that even the highest position, when disconnected from purpose, can be the beginning of ruin. And this is exactly where this story stops, just talking about an ancient event, and begins to talk about a much broader principle. And this is where this story stops being just about Lucifer and begins to reveal something about the entire logic of the fall. Because what happened there was not just the corruption of a high being, it was the exposition of a principle. Proximity to the light does not replace submission. The position does not guarantee permanence. Received greatness does not protect anyone when the heart begins to lean towards itself. And that makes everything much more serious than it seems. Because deep down, the first fall from the sky reveals that the central problem was never power, beauty, or prominence. The problem begins when the creature tries to transform gift into absolute identity. When what was received starts to be treated as own property. When serving seems small and exalting yourself begins to seem deserved. That's the mechanism. First, the function loses its luster. Afterwards, the self gains centrality. So purpose seems limiting. And finally, the rupture stops seeming like rebellion and begins to seem, for those who fell inside, a kind of entitlement. Do you see how profound this is? Lucifer's fall isn't just about a distant celestial event. It reveals the anatomy of rupture. It shows how pride does not arise first in great acts. It arises in internal interpretations, in the way someone starts to see their own importance, in the silent refusal to remain referenced in God. And that magnifies the impact of this story. Because the first one to fall wasn't the shortest. He was someone elevated. The first to break through was not far away. It was close. And exactly for this reason, this narrative works like an uncomfortable mirror. It shows that the greatest risk is not just in being outside the order, but in being inside it without remaining surrendered to its center. But there is an even more disturbing detail. This story does not just belong to heaven's past. It echoes whenever the creature prefers autonomy to dependence, whenever the function seems insufficient, whenever the reference to God begins to be exchanged for fascination with oneself. And perhaps that's why this first fall remains so current, because it doesn't just reveal who Lucifer was. It reveals how every rupture begins, before it is even seen. And after all this, the question is no longer just what happened to Lucifer. The question is what this first drop continues to try to reveal. Because, in the end, the story does not begin with monsters, nor with chaos, nor with darkness taking shape in front of everyone. It starts with something much quieter, and exactly for that reason, much more dangerous. It begins when an extraordinary creature stops accepting that his glory only made sense as long as he remained pointing towards the true center. This is the point that keeps echoing. Lucifer did not fall because he lacked position. He fell because his position was no longer enough. It didn't fall because it was far away. It fell because the proximity did not prevent internal deformation. And he didn't fall just because he wanted to go up. He fell because he wanted to climb up on his own. But then the question arises that remains open. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable of all. If the first rupture began within someone who was already part of the order, what really keeps a creature firm? Is it proximity? Is it shine? Is it function? Or is it the continuous willingness to remain referenced in God without transforming what you have received into a reason for self-exaltation? And this is where this story refuses to end simply. Why doesn't it close just one fall? She leaves a warning. The first to fall was also the first to reveal that ruin begins invisible. It begins when the heart leaves its place of service, even before the body leaves its place of honor. It begins when admiration for God gives way to fascination with oneself. And perhaps that's exactly why this narrative remains so powerful. It doesn't just force us to look back at an ancient event in the sky. It forces us to look at the principle behind it. What sustains someone high? What prevents greatness from being corrupted? What happens when the creature no longer just wants to reflect, but to be seen as a source? Maybe Lucifer's fall isn't just the story of the first one who came down. Perhaps it is the revelation of the first moment in which pride tried to occupy the place that could never be its own. And if that's how it all started, so the question that remains is not just who fell first. The question that remains is, how many breakdowns still start the same way, in silence?